Good evening, everybody. I think we're going to get started pretty soon here, if not right now. All right. Well, good evening. Welcome to The People versus Corporations, the story of Judge Miles Lord. I am Tessa Picata. I am a junior at St. Ben's. I am a political science and classics double major, and I'm also a student coordinator for the McCarthy Center. And tonight we are honored to have Roberta Walburn with us. So, last year, Roberta Walburn's book, Miles Lord, the Maverick Judge Who Brought Corporate America to Justice, was published. This book describes her unique experiences working as a law clerk to Judge Lord, a controversial Minnesotan district judge who decided landmark rulings against reserve mining and manufacturers at the Dalkon Shield IUD. Tonight, Roberta Walburn is going to talk about her experiences both as a clerk to the judge, as well as her career since then. And also on our panel tonight, we have Professor Phil Kronebusch. He's a political science professor here at St. John's University. And we also have Eli Poferl, who is a senior political science student at St. John's University and was a part of the McCarthy Center's book club. And on the back of your programs, there is all of the social media information if you want to follow us to learn about more book clubs. We have them a lot and they are great. So we are going to get started with a video.
Are you ready?
No.
The question was asked one time, as I remember, am I my brother's keeper? My answer to that was always a resounding yes.
How many federal judges can you name? I bet that if you can name only one, it is Judge Miles Lord of the Federal District Court.
He was a judge who didn't mind, as a matter of fact, enjoyed standing up to rich people and big corporations. He became one of the best known judges in America, I think, during those times.
And Judge Lord was one of those people that he could walk into a situation and he could ask about 10 or 15 questions and he would get right to the heart of an issue.
I had the impression of being a judge who, when he made up his mind, meant it. I don't think there's any use of being a judge if you don't decide anything. If you got on that job to be a judge, then judge. When somebody's right, tell them they're right. When somebody's wrong, tell them they're wrong.
Listen to me, please. You seem to be in charge. The judge will be the referee here. You answer the questions. If you don't do that, consequences may follow.
Judge Lord always took a side, and it was kind of easy to tell once.
Lawyers for Robbins objected to Judge Lord's statement, saying he was prejudiced. The judge told Robbins, "I certainly am, and that about winds me up."
Miles viewed his job as a judge as no less than saving the world.
I've been accused of being a busybody or an activist or reaching to help people. I have to let sympathy, passion influence me.
He has taught so many people how to really search their souls for being an advocate.
When people are looking all over this world for places to hide pollutants, industrial wastes that may do some good, but will in the long run kill us, I cannot compromise.
He had really strong principles and values about what's really important to people.
I thought Miles was the best thing to happen to the judiciary in the United States. And I was proud he was from Minnesota. And an Iron Ranger to boot.
I happen to believe that might does not make right. I believe that the poor are blessed, and that we have a duty to help them.
I'm not running against things. I'm going to run for things.
Oh no! That happened.
Wrong group.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for coming here tonight. I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'll just offer a couple of reflections about the book, but I really want to just even though we have something of a formal structure here, I want people to be able to ask their questions and have a more casual conversation. Thank you, Roberta, for coming. Let me begin by just saying I think it's a wonderful book. Let me just highlight two themes that I found really attractive in it. One is one of the things I think college students don't understand is the critical role of the document discovery process. And what's really neat about the book is really almost the page-turning, exciting description of what that document hunt looked like. And then also, that the document hunt is really like the critical issue, that once you had the documents, then A.H. Robbins was in some ways completely caught, that they knew about the dangers of the Dalkon Shield and that they were still marketing it and that they were not requiring that it be removed.
Yeah, let me just comment on the document discovery, and we'll talk more about that as the evening goes on. Most lawyers don't understand how critical document discovery is too, because on the surface it sounds boring. It's looking through paper as opposed to standing up in court and having a big dramatic moment. So that was one thing that Judge Lord taught me.
And the other theme I liked is just for students of Minnesota politics. I mean, anyone paying attention to Minnesota politics, I think people hear about this golden age when Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale and Miles Lord and Gene McCarthy and Orville Freeman were all active and in the prime of their careers. And the book captures that, I think, better than anything else I've read. And if you encounter a room full of old Democrats talking about the good old days, read this book and then you'll see what they're talking about. It really was a distinctive period of time, I think.
Yeah, I think, regardless of your party affiliation today, there's no denying that these were giants of politics, and not just in Minnesota, but throughout the country. And it's hard to imagine us ever having another collection of giants like that all in one state. It makes you yearn for the good old days.
Here's the question I have to start with, and I'm afraid it's an unavoidable one given our present climate. And I'm going to go straight to it, you guys, the Kavanaugh nomination. And if you're looking for a little bit of history, the Miles Lord book also completely captures, as we can see, let me find my page here. On page 138 to 139, you see Miles Lord gets nominated to become a federal district court judge. You then see that James Eastland, a senator from Mississippi, is chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that he's conducting investigations. He's ordering investigations to take place on Miles Lord because he doesn't quite buy this nomination. Eastland is not supporter of civil rights. Hubert Humphrey has then recommended Miles Lord, so Eastland is very suspicious of this nomination.
And Eastland was a Democrat.
Right, oh yes, a fellow Democrat.
Same party.
Same party, but then when push comes to shove, the committee hearing lasts 11 minutes, and the Senate vote is by unanimous voice vote. Okay, a completely different time than today.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it was pretty remarkable that Miles got to be a federal judge back when he did, which was in 1966, because he had already been in the public eye for 15 years and was already pretty controversial. And he never hid what his biases and beliefs were. So he was controversial, but a sign of different times, that regardless of how controversial he was, he had two home state senators, Eugene McCarthy and Walter Mondale, who would not back down from his nomination, and Hubert Humphrey at that time was vice president of the United States. So these were all young men who had come of age together in the 1940s, and they stood by each other. So it was a very different time.
Mm-hmm. Let me turn to Eli for an initial question.
My first question upon reading the book, and I was fascinated throughout it, was about how you kind of would switch back every chapter from either, on the case in the Dalkon Shield to kind of Miles' journey through politics and the judicial system. And I was just wondering what made you write it that way, because to me I thought it was very interesting, because as we see his kind of core values after obviously the initial, you give the background on him, you see kind of like what motivates him and how he responds throughout the case. And I thought that really, not only did it make the book more enjoyable and harder for me to put down, but it also gave me a better perspective of how well-rounded he was and how he stuck to his morals.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, because I spent a lot of time at the outset thinking about how to structure the book. And this is the first and only book I've ever written. So I was really excited to dig into it. And when I started, I went back and reread authors who I really admired. And one of my favorite authors is a New Yorker writer, John McPhee, and he's written a lot about writing. And one of his, and in fact, he has a book out now on writing, I think it's called. And one of the things he really stressed was you need to think hard about your structure of your, especially the longer the piece you're writing, certainly a full-length book, you really need to think about the structure and how to bring it together. And as I thought about that, I wanted to tell Miles' life story because I always wondered how he grew up to be the Maverick that he did, and how, and it's really, you really have to look not much further than his Iron Range beginnings, growing up very poor on the Iron Range, and then him meeting Hubert Humphrey and that influence to understand his journey. But then I had spent a year and a half clerking for the judge, and during that time he had one of the largest cases in the country, the Dalkon Shield IUD litigation, and I thought that was a great opportunity to show the judge up close and what it was like when he was involved in one of these epic cases on a day-to-day basis. And when I tried to figure out how to put those two threads together, if I wanted to tell the Dalkon story in more detail and just did the book in a chronological fashion, it wouldn't kick in until towards the end of the book. And so you'd kind of, and I saw the Dalkon Shield as kind of the narrative that compelled people through, and then the biography spacing. And I was really nervous before anybody read it whether those alternating chapters would work, because if they didn't, I was in big trouble.
I have a list of questions, but let me turn things over to you. Please.
Okay, so what do you think was Miles' personal stake in the Shield case?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a hard question too, because sure. Yeah, the question was what was his personal stake in the Dalkon Shield litigation, and I think it was a couple of things that came together. One is even though for many years he viewed himself as an old-fashioned male chauvinist, in part because of his daughters, he kind of was coming around and seeing the light, and he revered women in kind of a chauvinistic way at the start, and I think he was deeply offended that a company would put women at risk and harm women in the way, and so he really took that personal. He had two daughters who were around the same age as many of the Dalkon Shield victims, and so he could really see that from a personal family perspective. And also, since a theme of his in the book is standing up to big corporations that had done wrong, by the time Miles took on any of the Dalkon Shield cases, the litigation had been going on in front of other judges around the country for more than a decade. And I think once he took on some of the cases and saw the attorneys trying to stall and hide documents, I think that deeply offended him, the tactics of the company and how it had been going on for so long.
Mm-hmm. Sophia?
Well, you had full access to really a treasure trove, a storage unit. Can you tell a little bit more about that? And what did you find there that went into the book?
Yeah, so the question is, the fact that I had full access to the judge's and his family's storage unit. And at the outset, I went to the judge's two daughters, both of whom are attorneys, and found out about the storage unit and asked them for the keys. And they responded by asking whether they could have the right to review the manuscript before it was published. And that was certainly within their right to ask, but I told them no, because I didn't want, this is not an approved biography. I wanted to have the freedom to tell the story the way, wherever the facts took me. And to their credit, they agreed, and they just gave me the keys to the storage unit, and it was just, a big old storage unit out, actually right behind Paisley Park, as it turned out. I was going there for a year before I found out that Princess Paisley Park was right next door. And it was just, dozens and dozens of boxes. When the daughters had moved the judge out of his house, they had thrown all his papers into boxes, no rhyme or reason to them, but it included his personal letters. It included all kinds of private memorabilia. And also, the judge had a habit, thankfully, for many, many years, of never being far from a little pocket dictaphone. And so he would dictate his contemporaneous thoughts, and his secretaries would type them up, and that would be in the storage unit, too. So I love, Phil mentioned document discovery, and throughout my years as an attorney, I've really loved to just muck around in documents, and there I was in the storage unit. And one of the, to me, the most rewarding finds was I found letters that the judge had written in 1968 during the presidential campaign, when two of his best friends and two of the icons from Minnesota politics, Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy, were running against each other for the Democratic nomination. And Miles, even though he's a federal judge and should not have been involved in politics, appointed himself the unofficial envoy between the two candidates and was literally jumping back and forth on different planes with the two candidates. And in the storage unit were letters that he had written to Hubert during that time. And he'd spend the day with Eugene, and then he'd write a long, letters like people don't write today, but long, 3, 4, 5-page letter to Hubert outlining what had happened.
And let me draw you out on that just a little bit, because then what your book makes it seem like that there was really, Miles was in some ways trying to strike a deal between Humphrey and McCarthy, and even like trying to negotiate that McCarthy would be the vice presidential candidate to Hubert Humphrey. So do you know whether from the Humphrey or the McCarthy side, whether anyone took Miles's efforts seriously?
Surprisingly, because it sounds like pie in the sky, but his grand idea was Hubert for president and Eugene for vice president. And he talked to both candidates about that. And from reading the letters, I thought it was pie in the sky, but when I did further research, I found it was actually taken seriously. Eugene was always pretty coy about whether he was interested or not, pretty non-committal. But Miles never gave up until long after everyone else figured out it would never fly.
I'm sorry, I know we're going to go to more discussion, but I can't help but ask then the follow-up. The book makes it clear that as Miles is pursuing the judgeship, that Gene McCarthy is his most steadfast supporter. That even Humphrey was a little, hinted, maybe, is this like quite right for you? But Gene McCarthy is most steadfast, but then we sort of pay attention to McCarthy in the McCarthy Center, and he's then characterized as often the more aloof politician, but then Miles is completely I'm meeting people, very deeply wanting the personal connection. They seem very different. How do we reconcile this?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to psychoanalyze Gene McCarthy when I was doing the research. And, the popular wisdom was that Miles really owed his judgeship to Hubert Humphrey, and the two were really inseparable. But I was surprised to learn, just as you say, Phil, that how influential and steadfast Gene McCarthy was in supporting Miles. And they were, on the surface, two very different people. I mean, Miles and Hubert were both loved people, and Gene was more of a loner. And just to put it kind of as kindly as I can, Gene didn't like really any other politicians. I mean, he just, whatever it was, he didn't have much respect for other politicians. But he loved Miles. And I think what bound them together was they were both individuals who were willing to buck the tide and forge their own paths, regardless of how tough the going was. In fact, the tougher the going, the more they strode out. And I think they admired each other for that.
Interesting. Other questions, or Eli?
Yeah, I was interested in when Miles was kind of going in between Gene and Hewitt, because it seemed like that was his most, the time where he was most a mediator, and it kind of seemed like he was mostly trying to, find a settlement, whereas with all of his other cases, it kind of seemed like he really wanted to end the prosecution. So I was interested by that, as well as I almost thought by the end that Gene might have made the better judge and being impartial, and Miles might have made the better politician.
That's a great insight. I had never thought of that, but as I think about it, there's really something to that, because Miles loved people so much, and he loved campaigning, and even when he was a judge, even aside from 1968, when, as you say, he was kind of the mediator, and he was the mediator because he loved them both.
Mm-hmm.
But Miles, as I write in the book, he started out as a politician and running for Minnesota Attorney General and serving 3 terms. But he didn't like having to fundraise, and because he felt that made him beholden to people. And I also felt that having grown up on the Iron Range and coming from such a poor family, having that steady paycheck, so as a federal judge, you're appointed for life, and not having to worry about being out of work, I think, was a huge driving factor for Miles. And Gene, as a federal judge, I think actually he would have enjoyed that more than he enjoyed being in the Senate.
As the elder in the room, we have, for our students, we have 2 judges here. One who worked with Miles Lord. I shouldn't say worked. Charlie, what
Faced.
Faced.
I think, face would be the right word.
And the other observation I make is that for us older, Eli looks exactly like Fritz Mondale did back in the beginning. He has the same face.
Thank you.
John.
Could you comment on the relationship that Miles had with some of the more prominent local lawyers that appeared before him, some representing major corporations like Bob Sharon representing Reserve Mining, and how they kind of maintained their either personal or professional relationship, even though they might have been on opposite sides?
Yeah, it was complicated. So if you were a plaintiff's lawyer suing a big corporation, and you drew Miles as your judge, it was like, you hit the lottery. But I would say that, even though Miles had, his biases, you knew where he stood, and you could be, Judge Flynn might not agree with this, but you could represent a corporation and go, maybe not a railroad though, and go into his, and go into his courtroom, and if the plaintiff had a terrible case, he would see through that, and you would do okay. So he had his biases. I hate to say this in front of judges, but every judge has his or her own bias. I mean, it comes with the territory of being a human being, right? But the question is, can you look at the case in front of you and rule on the case in terms of what the facts and the law tell you? So. Miles, so there were defense lawyers who didn't mind being in front of the judge, because if they played it straight and the other side had a weak case, they would do fine. Bob Sharon is a great example of how complicated relationships could be. So for the younger students in the audience, Bob Sharon was an attorney, largely a defense attorney, and he also served on the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Chief Justice.
Yeah, and 2 stints, once as Chief Justice. And he was a Republican. So, Republican, defending corporations. He was one of Reserve Mining Company's original lead attorneys. And, for those of you who read the book, Reserve Mining was one of Judge Lord's landmark cases. But they had a friendship throughout it. And what was interesting in a lot of the judges' cases, including the Dalkon Shield IUD litigation, he always, and again, you might not agree, Judge Flynn, but he had kind of a soft spot in his heart for the local the Minnesota attorneys, whether they were plaintiffs or defense. But out-of-state corporate defense lawyers, they had the roughest road because, and I think again, this, I said so much of who we became came from his Iron Range roots, and Rangers, at least in the era when Miles grew up, did not trust out-of-towners. And, when these fancy lawyers came in from out of town, the judge had immediate distrust for them. And so that relationship was not so complicated.
Well, what about the relationship that he had with even some fellow DFLers like Orville Freeman and Judge Haney from Duluth? There was a lot of friction.
There was. And again, it was more complicated than it would seem from the surface. When on the surface, Miles is one of the really founding fathers of the modern DFL. But when you get down to reality, he had some great friends who were Republicans, again, demonstrating how different times are today. So, Bob Sharon, Leonard Lindquist, Republicans who were his lifelong friends. And some of the DFLers, Judge Haney, who was a judge up in Duluth, who, Miles and Judge Haney had nearly identical biographies and, grew up poor in small towns and original DFLers. And they kind of had a love-hate relationship. And I couldn't quite figure that one out. But I think part of it was egos. They both had healthy egos. And I think that was probably part of it.
Judge Flynn?
Let me just defend myself for 10 seconds.
Right. Equal time.
I tried, as you know, cases in front of Miles and was abused because and I'll use that word intentionally, because I represent the railroad. On the other hand, as I told people, I believe strongly in many cases that Miles's aims were good. I mean, getting those documents out of the Robbins, that deserved to happen, getting Reserve shut down. And that goes back to one of the questions I raised about, do the ends justify the means? I suppose it depends on where you sit, but, his methods bothered me, and I think they bother a lot of lawyers. I don't know where that boils into a question, but
yeah, well,
I'm not completely anti-Miles Lord.
Yeah, no, and that's a fair comment, and Miles took the fastest road he could to the end result.
Yes.
And do the ends justify the means? That's not an easy question to answer. I think sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And so in his big cases like Dalkon Shield and Reserve Mining, people who might know a little bit about the cases look at the end result. So in Reserve Mining, he orders Reserve to shut down at midnight of the very day he issued his order. But what people might not know was that came after 2 years of litigation, the company lying to him about having documents that the judge eventually uncovered, and the judge just finally losing his patience after 2 years, and he had the documents in front of him that would warrant his order. Dalkon Shield was 10 years of litigation. Again, it was documents and looking for secret studies of the defective tail string. And people remember the speech that the judge gave at the end of the litigation where he blasted the A.H. Robbins Company, which manufactured it, and he ended up being hauled up on judicial misconduct charges. But again, this company had been running rampant in litigation for 10 years before Miles came. So, it's not the easiest question to answer. Yeah.
How was he on criminal cases?
Oh, so you're next.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so criminal cases. So criminal cases. So Miles, he was an old prosecutor. So his first job was an assistant U.S. attorney. He, in the early 1950s, he went after some of the last old-time gangsters in the Twin Cities, and And then as Minnesota Attorney General and U.S. Attorney for Minnesota, he was a prosecutor, and he never lost that prosecutor's blood. So criminal defense lawyers hated to be in front of him because he would jump in, and if he thought the prosecutor was not doing a good enough job, and he almost never thought the prosecutor was doing a good enough job, he would jump in and kind of help them try their case.
Please.
Yeah, so, Ms. Walburn, question for you. First of all, thank you for coming. All the students are really privileged. Thankful to have your
Thanks for
perspective.
inviting me.
So, are there any things that, in retrospect, you wish you could add to your material, stories, characteristics of Judge Lord, or things you wish you could convey differently?
Yeah, so, again, because this is my first book, I thought, wow, this is a book I can write as long as I want. I can put everything in here. And so my first draft, I just wrote and put everything in, and then looked at it, and it was, 600 pages. I ended up cutting it in half about. So, and I think that's, I talked earlier about the writing process, and I think I've written a lot over the years. I love to write, and I've been a newspaper reporter, and as a lawyer, I love to write, and now have written a book. But there's, until I wrote the book, I was always very restricted in terms of length, and a book is a different beast. But one thing that's universal about the writing process is there's almost no one who can write a good first draft. And so what makes writing better is editing and re-editing and editing again. And so I cut a lot out, but the amazing thing is when I go back and look at it now, I can't hardly even remember what I cut out, and I cut out half of the book. So I think, and I haven't reread it in a while, so it's kind of scary to think of doing that. And so until I do that, I probably won't have a good answer to your question. Yeah.
At the beginning of the book, you were planning on being a journalist, and I was wondering how your clerkship for Miles most profoundly impacted your career after that.
Yeah, it really changed my life. And, I knew it at the time, but doing the book, when I was researching and writing the book, I was just kind of like knocking myself in the head and saying, well, of course my career turned out the way it did because of my clerkship with Miles. So I'd come to Minnesota as a reporter for the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and actually was stationed in St. Cloud for my first 2 years covering this region of the state, and loved journalism and wanted to stay in journalism, and went to law school to give myself a credential to help my journalism. And then one thing led to another, so I start the book out with my introduction to Miles and getting offered a clerkship, and I figured, by then Miles was already a legend, and I figured that you can't turn down this opportunity. And I can always go back to journalism. And just spending the year and a half clerking for the judge and seeing what the law could accomplish, and seeing different lawyers coming in, just opened my eyes to the possibilities, and decided to try and give the legal profession a shot. So kind of my message to students is always, you might think you know exactly what you want to do, and maybe that is, how it's going to turn out, but don't close your eyes to different opportunities that might cross your path, because now's the time to kind of keep your eyes wide open and experiment.
I got another question if you're speaking to us students. I think a lot of questions and material we've been kind of asking about has asked you to kind of like look back in the past. And with this question, I want to kind of maybe switch your perspective to maybe like more of a futuristic look. And that is, are there any ways that you see, despite those different times that you're talking about, that us students can inherit Judge Lord's unorthodox, Maverick kind of attitude while in our younger years? Or is it problematic thing for us to foster that kind of mentality without prestige and status that we have?
Yeah, well, I think we can all be Mavericks in our own way, right? So, different personalities, different professions, but I think, sort of the universal message, I think, from Miles is to kind of be true to yourself and, find what your passions are and then pursue them in your own way, and don't let someone tell you, what you can and can't do or how you should be doing things, because I think that's universal, and it holds true today as always.
More questions? Back there.
obviously you studied this era in which Miles Lord and Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey lived and worked, and that political climate. What are the major differences, especially for us younger students in the crowd, what are the major differences between the political landscape of that time and our current political landscape? And do you think our current political landscape is just part of almost the normal function, or do you think there's something more sinister happening?
Yeah, well, it's definitely worlds apart from what it used to be. I mean, there's always been partisanship and, and Democrats and Republicans and fierce party loyalties. But I don't think the parties or the country were as nearly as divided as they are today. And I think, the fact, as I've talked about, that Miles, although he was an iconic DFLer, had great Republican friends, how when he got before the Judiciary Committee, it was a fellow Democrat who was kind of holding him up. I mean, that kind of thing would never happen today. And so I think it's unfortunate. I hope it's passing because, it's great to have two parties going at each other and hopefully, better ideas come out of the fight. But now it's so personal and so hard-edged and so mean-spirited that it's hard to see anything good coming out of it.
John?
Which percentage of Judge Lord's cases were upheld on appeal, and which percentage of his cases were not?
So I tried to find that statistic, and I couldn't because I think they track it now, but they didn't back then. And so, there were only perceptions, and some people said, he really wasn't reversed any more than other judges, and other people said he was reversed all the time. So I don't know the answer to that, but because he either was reversed or ran into trouble with the Eighth Circuit on his highest profile cases, including reserve mining and Dalkon Shield, that's the perception, is that he was, reversed all the time. But I don't really know the answer to that question.
I want to extend a question about the political change and then connect it to the Iron Range, because of course Miles Lord is a ranger and was a hero in his day, but we've already heard in some ways the end of this story. I mean, reserve mining loses, the taconite industry never is what it was before. That area of Minnesota is now economically depressed, and they hope is now springing for this copper nickel mine. So do you know what Miles Lord's reputation on the Iron Range is today, and then what would he say about the possibility of this new mining proposal?
Yeah, I really don't know what his reputation is today on the range. In terms of the new mining proposals, I think if he were looking at them from after his experience on reserve mining, he'd be deeply skeptical of the mining companies. But again, I think he would, which is not the public perception of him, but he would dig into what the actual facts were for this specific proposal before he'd let the lightning bolts fly.
Jim?
As one who drank some of the Lake Superior water, Duluth water during that era.
Right.
I have more of a personal interest than some people. But has there been any studies lately? I have not looked. Has there been any studies lately about what has happened with the suspended asbestos?
No, and that was, Miles, almost until the day he died, was fighting to get that studied. And not just the waste tailings in Lake Superior, but also for the entire taconite industry. And into his 90s, he was writing letters to the legislature and the governor seeking studies. There have been, there's a study, I think under the auspices of the University of Minnesota, that has looked at that issue, but I think it's deeply flawed and inconclusive.
And that would be one of those things where the outcome and the methods and stuff would be a very specific and real.
Yeah.
Real outcome.
Yeah.
Would be.
For students who haven't read the book and want just a thumbnail sketch, the reserve mining case addresses this question about, can a mining company actually dump thousands of tons a day of iron ore, what were called tailings, that included asbestos fibers, into Lake Superior? That's the entire case, and the answer for a time was that's exactly what they were doing, and the reserve mining case is what stops that.
And people were drinking the water unfiltered.
If you think things are bad now, that really was worse.
Yeah, and it was the first big environmental case of the early environmental era in the 1970s, and the judge was the first judge in the country to order the shutdown of a major industrial plant over pollution concerns.
Did you ever run across any reflections by Miles? I mean, you said you didn't interview him for the book because he was scalped. Did he reflect on his own career? And it was, I'm just curious of what he thought as he aged. I mean, he lived well into his 90s.
Yeah, he lived to be 98, just died a couple of years ago. He always wanted to write his own book, but he was like too close to the story to really do it himself. So, and I read in the storage room, I found manuscripts of his mostly dictations for his own book. He was really proud of what he had done, and he used to say that his only regrets were the times he didn't go far enough. So he never regretted the times he went out there. He never regretted his battles with the Eighth Circuit or getting yanked off the reserve mining case. The end of the reserve mining story is after the judge ordered the shutdown, eventually the Eighth Circuit removed the judge for bias, but a second judge came in and affirmed the order for shutdown. So, yeah, he was pretty proud, but he retired from the bench at age 66, and he was a young 66, and he would practice law for a couple of decades. He was ready to leave the bench, though, when he left. I think he was kind of worn out at the time. Yes?
It goes back to the manuscript that he wrote for himself. You said there was an end chapter. He didn't finish the autobiography, but he had an end chapter. I was wondering, what did he write in that end chapter?
Yeah, so he had, it was like a full, start to finish manuscript. It just was kind of fantastical. So, he wasn't really tethered to the facts so much in this manuscript. He just kind of picked up a dictaphone, and he hired a couple of writers to kind of help him. But it was there were some nuggets in there, but it was mostly just someone kind of stream of consciousness talking into it.
Was it anything worse than "Welcome, you sons of bitches"?
Oh yeah. That was, that wasn't in there. But so for people who haven't read the book, the Dalkon Shield story, the short version of that is a Fortune 500 company from Richmond, Virginia, was manufacturing an IUD that was the most best-selling IUD in the world. But it had a flaw, which was a tail string that whipped bacteria into the uterus and caused horrendous infections in women. Many lost their fertility, and a number of them died. And after the judge got the cases, when he was done with the cases, he ordered 3 of the top executives into his courtroom and read them the Riot Act of speech, which got him brought up on judicial misconduct charges. And he had dictated the speech, the first draft of the speech, and then played it for me because I was supposed to clean it up a little bit. And it started out by, rise you sons of bitches and hear these words. And I was like, and he's looking at me, and I'm like, Judge, maybe we could tone it down a little bit. But I actually had, I had saved a couple of boxes of materials from when I clerked, and I have the original draft of the speech, so that was one of the things I saved, yeah.
Other questions? Tony?
Releasing the original draft of that speech?
Yeah, I mean, it's out. I have part of it in the book, but yeah, it's out there.
If readers were only going to take one thing away from this book, what would you hope that would be?
I think that it's that one person can make a difference. But, you know, going back to your question, kind of combining the questions, one person can make a difference, but, you know, you got to go out there, and it's tough, but do it in your own way. And it doesn't matter the field you're in, you know, whether it's law or peace studies or, you know, whatever. Yeah, do your thing and make a difference.
Olivia's peace studies, so she's the whatever.
The impact of the rule of law. I mean, I'm thinking about what, like we talked about the two young girls who wanted to be on the boys' tennis team, and the changes the impact that ruling has had on many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the same with taking on big corporations, whether it's a Dalkon Shield or other, the cigarette lobby or cigarettes. I mean, changes have occurred because of lawyers willing to take risks against what they see as evil.
Right, and I mean, that's why I ended up changing my career path and going into law, because I saw it happening in front of me when I was clerking for the judge. So, yeah.
Any comments on judicial temperament as theme of the day or the week or what have you? And just, you know, Professor Kronebusch brought up Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Any comments on judicial temperament, Judge Lord's temperament, and other? That is an issue, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to go there. You know, a lot of people didn't think Judge Lord had judicial temperament, but I would say that compared to what we saw in the hearing last week with Judge Kavanaugh, it was night and day. And I, you know, never saw or, you know, heard of anything in my research where Judge Lord acted like that. You know, and again, it's not a partisan thing, and it's not a, you know, whether you agree or disagree with where Judge Kavanaugh is on the merits of cases, but just someone yelling and screaming and crying and carrying on and having a partisan meltdown in front of the Judiciary Committee is just, in my opinion, not appropriate for a judge.
Other questions?
In regards to the
go ahead, Eli.
In regards to the reserve mining case, obviously Miles grew up on the Iron Range and benefited from mining as a child. Obviously, you talked about how they had better schools and how it benefited him. How, when he had to pick up the case at the beginning without all this knowledge and without all the documents found yet, how was he? How did he deal with that kind of, you know, complexity of being stuck kind of between a guy who's fought for the little man, you know, his whole life and tried to, you know, go against corporations, but also a corporation in an area where, you know, he benefited from as well, and for caring about the public perception so much, and especially in his like hometown and area.
Yeah, one of the things that surprised me when I was doing the research for the book is that because I knew the end of the story, but the beginning of the story is when the judge first took on the case, he was terribly conflicted because he knew what those jobs meant to Iron Rangers, and he knew a lot of kids he had grown up with were working in the plant, relatives were working in the plant, and it had been DFLers, including his you know, best buddy Hubert Humphrey, who had brought reserve mining to Minnesota, really gone out there because of the jobs. And in fact, the lawyers for the Justice Department who were suing reserve seriously considered moving to disqualify Judge Lord at the beginning of the case because they were afraid that he would be biased against the company. And it was, you know, while, again, people who know about the case might know about him throwing the lightning bolt at the end, ordering the shutdown of the plant, it was only over the process of a couple long years of litigation and trial and the documents which led him to do really a 180.
Mm-hmm.
Chris wanted in.
In your research for the book, and you look at I'm looking for some comments on the landscape of the legal profession in the Twin Cities, Minnesota area. You know, the anti-Semitism was so strong for so long. Firms like Leonard Street Diner that were started because people couldn't, if they were Jewish, get jobs at one of the larger firms. what did you learn, or as an attorney for many years now, what are your perspectives on how that landscape was and how it is now and how it's changing?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the anti-Semitism. So two things that really marked the Twin Cities in the 20s, 30s, 40s, even into the 50s, it was known as one of the most anti-Semitic cities in the country, and it was also known as one of the most gangster-ridden cities in the country. The U.S. Attorney General called the Twin Cities the poison spot of the nation. And Hubert Humphrey, when he became mayor in the 1940s, really was the beginning of turning it around on both fronts, going after gangsters and really helping to turn the Twin Cities into a more tolerant society. And so, I mean, the law firm that I worked with for many, many years, the Robbins Law Firm, was also founded because Jewish attorneys couldn't get hired by other law firms back in the late 1940s. So that's changed dramatically in the Twin Cities.
Judge Charlie and I are members of the St. Paul Athletic Club, and we did not have any Jewish members. We had no African American members. We had no women. They could come in the front door. They could come in the side door. So I was present when first Jewish member of the St. Paul Athletic Club was admitted. I was present when a young African American in St. Paul was admitted some years later, and Rosalie Butler, who didn't come in the side door, came in the front door and ran into a city council member like she was, and he said, "You've got to go out and come in the side door," and she marched right through and into the athletic club. So she didn't get admitted, she just stormed in. I don't know if there was any formal, but it was, and the Minneapolis was the same. The major clubs, the Minneapolis, the Minnesota clubs, did not have any minority and or women members well into the 60s.
Until your leadership.
Well, no. And I should also observe that St. John's had the first Jewish chair, if you will, in any Catholic college university in America. And for generations, the Phillips family were the chairholder, that is to say, the Phillips family one era, the next one, or the next one. We didn't have a name chair, it was that. And then later the Phillips family founded the Jewish Center here at St. John's and St. Thomas, which continues to exist today.
Mo, did you want to say something?
I was going to say, I think Hubert's wife, Muriel, was the first female member at the Minneapolis Club.
Probably when she was the senator.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. That's right.
Go ahead.
Other questions from students? I just want to make sure Dominic.
Yeah, so as perhaps evidenced by some of the laughter in the room today, it seems that judges who make their political positions too clear nowadays aren't very well liked. Yet Judge Miles Lord remained quite respectful, and I'm wondering why you think that is.
Well, respect was not really a word that went with Judge Lord when he was on the bench. I mean, he was not viewed as kind of, a model judge by any means. I'm not, sure which judges you're referring to about judges today who are making their opinions known, because, again, to go back to the Judge Kavanaugh example, in his confirmation hearings, he didn't say anything about what his views were, right? So people know what his views are, maybe because they've, read his opinions or whatever, but that's one big difference, is that, he wouldn't answer the questions, right? So he's controversial, but not because he's out there candidly stating what his views are.
Tessa, are you trying to get our attention?
Yes. All right. Is this on? No? Awesome. I'll just talk loudly. We're fine. All right. 7 o'clock, and thus ends the panel, unfortunately, because this conversation is so interesting. I would like to thank once again our panelists Phil and Eli, and special thank you to Roberta Walburn for joining us tonight.
Thank you.